Sometimes the loudest conversations happen in silence. When two souls stop reaching for each other, when words fade and messages stop, what remains isn't emptiness, it's revelation. Because in that stillness, everything you tried to understand about them begins to unfold, and everything they tried to escape from within themselves finally catches up to them. Emotional detachment and emotional withdrawal may look the same on the surface, but they are born from very different internal realities. When contact stops between you and an avoidant person, what you often see is not heartbreak or regret. It's quiet. It's their version of peace. But that quiet isn't always calm. It's the silence of someone who has spent years equating closeness with danger. To the avoidant mind, intimacy has always felt like exposure, and exposure means losing control. When they retreat, they're not trying to punish you or make you chase them. They're trying to find safety inside their own walls. For someone deeply connected to them, that silence feels like abandonment. But for the avoidant, it feels like relief. Distance is their emotional oxygen. It gives them space to breathe without the constant pressure of vulnerability. Where you may feel anxiety when communication breaks, they feel temporary equilibrium. The absence of emotional demands, expectations, or potential rejection allows them to feel like they've regained balance. But this balance is fragile. It's not born from healing, but from avoidance. They don't miss the person immediately because missing requires emotional closeness, and closeness is something they've spent a lifetime suppressing. In the early stages of no contact, they might even convince themselves that cutting communication was the right decision. Their nervous system relaxes because the threat of emotional exposure has been removed. They don't overthink the silence. They settle into it like a familiar room. However, what looks like strength is often emotional numbness. Their detachment isn't the absence of feeling, it's the result of feelings being buried too deep to reach. The avoidant individual doesn't know how to hold both love and independence at once, so they sacrifice connection to protect autonomy. Yet, emotional withdrawal comes with a hidden cost. While detachment helps them survive the discomfort of closeness, it also isolates them from genuine emotional fulfillment. Over time, the relief they felt begins to dull, replaced by a subtle emptiness. They may not name it as loneliness, but they begin to sense something missing in the silence. Still, their instinct is to suppress it rather than face it. This is why, during no contact, they can appear indifferent while secretly wrestling with confusion. The more they deny what they feel, the stronger their internal disconnection grows. What you're witnessing in an avoidance behavior after no contact begins isn't coldness. It's conditioning. Emotional withdrawal is a defense that was built long before you entered their life. The silence that hurts you is the same silence that protects them. When communication stops, they don't immediately fall apart. They retreat into a familiar emotional pattern where distance equals control. They detach not because they don't care, but because caring threatens their sense of safety. Emotional detachment keeps them functional, while emotional withdrawal keeps them protected. To understand this difference is to understand that their quiet after no contact is not peace. It's survival disguised as calm. When communication stops between you and an avoidant person, something begins to stir beneath the surface of their composed silence. At first, it appears as though they've moved on effortlessly. They appear calm, even unaffected. But what happens inside them is far more complicated than the stillness they show. The silence that once brought relief gradually starts to reveal an internal conflict they've spent their whole lives trying to avoid. For the avoidant, the absence of contact doesn't immediately register as loss. It registers as safety. But over time, that safety begins to feel unsettling because what was once a shield starts to turn into a mirror reflecting everything they've suppressed. Avoidants are experts at compartmentalizing their emotions. They push discomfort into mental boxes and tell themselves they're fine. That distance is healthier than chaos. Yet the human mind cannot suppress what it refuses to process forever. As the days of silence stretch on, something begins to shift within them. The relief that came from not having to engage emotionally starts to erode, leaving behind an unexpected hollowness. The mind that once found peace in solitude begins to feel restless. The silence that once protected them begins to echo too loudly. They start to feel the weight of what's been left unspoken, the memories that were easier to deny, and the emotions that were never properly felt. At this stage, confusion takes root. Their internal world becomes a quiet battleground between logic and emotion. Logic tells them that staying distant is the right choice, that emotional safety lies in detachment. Emotion whispers something entirely different. It reminds them of connection, of comfort, of the subtle warmth that once felt threatening but now feels missing. They begin to question their feelings, not in words but in sensations. A sudden pang of nostalgia, a dream that brings your image back, a song that feels heavier than it used to. This inner dissonance unsettles them because it challenges their carefully built emotional walls. Avoidants do not easily acknowledge longing. It doesn't arrive as a direct thought, it seeps in through subtle cracks. They may notice they're more irritable, distracted, or withdrawn than usual without realizing why. They may try to bury themselves in work, distractions, or fleeting interactions that keep them from sitting in the quiet too long. But the silence itself becomes a teacher, forcing them to confront feelings they've long buried under layers of independence and control. This inner conflict is not something they can express outwardly. For an avoidant, to admit emotional confusion feels like losing power. So they continue acting distant even as something within them begins to unravel. They might appear detached to the world, but their mind keeps replaying fragments of the bond they thought they could escape. What was once a conscious choice to stay away slowly turns into an involuntary confrontation with everything they feared about intimacy. The silence that once felt safe now begins to expose the emptiness they tried so hard to hide. When two people stop contacting each other, what unfolds is not just distance, it's reflection. For the avoidant, silence functions like a mirror they can no longer avoid. In relationships, they often use the presence of another person as a distraction from their inner world. The connection gives them something to manage, something to control, something to keep their focus outward rather than inward. But when that external dynamic disappears, when there are no more messages to ignore or boundaries to defend, they are left alone with themselves. And that stillness becomes confronting. The silence that once felt like relief begins to reveal the truth that they have spent years avoiding, that their emotional detachment is not peace, but protection. The mirror effect begins subtly. Without your presence, the avoidant no longer has an emotional target to project onto. They can't deflect feelings by blaming the other person for being too emotional, too needy, or too intense. Instead, the silence becomes reflective, the traits they once criticized or ran from start to echo back from within. They begin to see that what they rejected in you often mirrored what they could not accept in themselves. The need for closeness, the fear of vulnerability, the longing for emotional security. What was once a battle between two people slowly becomes an internal confrontation with their own suppressed emotions. This reflection doesn't happen consciously. It unfolds in quiet, unguarded moments, late nights when their mind drifts, mornings when the absence of connection feels heavier than it used to. The person they distanced from becomes less of a memory and more of a symbol. You become a representation of the emotional part of themselves they have long denied. The same vulnerability they found unbearable in you begins to show itself in them, and that realization can feel deeply uncomfortable. They may not know how to process it, but they begin to sense that their avoidance has not freed them. It has isolated them. The mirror effect exposes a pattern. The avoidant begins to notice how they repeat emotional cycles, how each time closeness grows, their instinct is to retreat, and how each retreat leaves them emptier than before. This pattern becomes harder to deny when silence removes all distractions. There's no emotional noise to drown it out, no arguments to justify distance, no partner to blame. There's only their own reflection, one shaped by fear, longing, and self-protection. The absence of contact becomes an unintentional form of self-awareness. As this realization grows, it creates both discomfort and clarity. Discomfort because it forces them to see the cost of their emotional walls, and clarity because they begin to recognize that the safety they sought in distance has become a prison. What once felt like control now feels like isolation. Through silence, the avoidant is faced with the truth that the emotional disconnection they created to survive has also kept them from experiencing genuine love. The mirror of absence becomes the most honest reflection they have ever seen. When communication ends and silence settles between you and an avoidant person, time begins to work in a way that exposes what their defenses once concealed. At first, they appear detached, as if nothing has changed. But what unfolds beneath that calm surface is a gradual, delayed realization of the bond that once existed. Avoidants are not emotionally absent. They are emotionally delayed. Their feelings move slowly, surfacing only after the external noise fades. When you were present, their instinct to protect themselves from closeness overshadowed their ability to feel the connection deeply. But when distance grows and the emotional threat disappears, space is created for reflection, and that is when realization begins. Initially, they convince themselves that separation was necessary. They justify the silence as a healthy boundary, telling themselves that they need time to think, to focus, to breathe. The absence feels manageable at first because they associate detachment with safety. But as the days turn into weeks, something begins to shift. The memories that were once suppressed start resurfacing uninvited. The tone of your voice, the way you made them feel understood, the calmness you brought to their chaos, these fragments start to replay quietly in their mind. They don't seek them out, they simply appear. What was once dismissed as ordinary begins to feel meaningful, and what was once taken for granted begins to reveal its depth. Avoidants experience emotion in reverse. They often feel things fully only after the moment has passed, when it no longer threatens their sense of control. This is why their realization comes so late. It's not that they didn't care. It's that caring was too overwhelming when the connection was alive. Once the emotional intensity fades, they gain the distance their mind needs to process what their heart was already feeling. The stillness of no contact removes the need for defense, and in that stillness, they start to feel the emotional weight of what was lost. They begin to understand that the person they pushed away was not trying to confine them, but to connect with them. That understanding often arrives not as a sudden epiphany, but as a quiet ache that grows stronger with time. They might not express it, but internally, they begin to see the difference between peace and emptiness. The space that once felt freeing starts to feel vacant. The detachment that once gave them comfort now feels like isolation. This delayed realization becomes both a confrontation and a lesson. The mind that once justified distance now struggles to explain the sense of absence it feels. They start to recognize that emotional safety without emotional connection isn't true safety. It's loneliness disguised as independence. As this awareness deepens, many avoidants find themselves caught between the desire to reach out and the fear of vulnerability that keeps them frozen. Their silence continues, but it's no longer peaceful. It's filled with the quiet recognition of what they had only learned to value after it was gone. When contact ends between you and an avoidant person, silence becomes the ground where transformation quietly begins. At first, Both individuals experience the distance differently. For you, it may feel like loss, confusion, or grief. For them, it feels like relief, stability, and the return of emotional control. Yet as time stretches on, that same silence that once separated begins to shape both people in profoundly different ways. No contact doesn't only create distance, it creates perspective. It allows what was hidden beneath constant interaction to surface, revealing wounds, fears, and truths that neither person could face while entangled in the emotional push and pull of the relationship. For the avoidant, this transformation is slow and often painful. They have spent much of their lives constructing emotional walls to survive closeness, believing that distance is strength and vulnerability is weakness. But silence challenges that belief. In the absence of communication, their emotional system starts to confront what avoidance has protected them from, their own longing. Without the distraction of control or withdrawal, they begin to encounter the feelings they buried beneath self-reliance. What once felt like safety begins to feel like emptiness. Over time, the avoidant begins to sense that their isolation is not peace, but loneliness disguised as independence. This quiet realization forces them to question the very patterns that once made them feel secure. For the person on the other side, transformation happens in a different rhythm. The initial pain of disconnection often turns into clarity. The silence that felt unbearable becomes a space for healing. The absence of mixed signals and emotional confusion allows for introspection and self-restoration. Where once there was a need to be understood or validated, there grows a new understanding of emotional boundaries and self-worth. Through no contact, you begin to see that loving someone who fears intimacy is not a reflection of your inadequacy. It is an invitation to understand your own attachment patterns. The silence becomes a mirror that teaches you how to hold love without losing yourself in it. Over time, both individuals begin to change in ways neither expected. The avoidant starts to feel the emotional consequences of avoidance, realizing that protecting themselves from pain has also cost them connection. You begin to rebuild your emotional center, understanding that love cannot thrive without mutual vulnerability. The dynamic that once felt like an endless loop of closeness and withdrawal now becomes a source of wisdom. Through distance, both begin to see the truth about themselves. One learns the cost of running from love, and the other learns the strength of letting go. Transformation through silence is never easy. It's a process of unraveling old emotional patterns to make space for new awareness. No contact becomes more than a boundary. It becomes a teacher. It shows that love, when it isn't met with equal openness, cannot survive. But it also shows that silence has the power to heal, reveal, and transform both hearts in profoundly different ways. When an avoidant and you stop contacting each other, it isn't just an ending, it's an awakening. The silence exposes what words once concealed, your strength to release and their struggle to feel. You both begin to transform in opposite directions, you toward healing and self-awareness, and them toward the truth they've spent years avoiding. In the end, no contact becomes more than distance. It becomes the space where truth finally breathes and both hearts learn what love truly meant when the noise was gone.